I remember as a kid, reading a one-volume copy of H.G. Wells' History of the World, that talked about the Neanderthals and so forth. This was in the, I was born in 1935, so this was in the early 40s. Wow, that's fascinating. I went to public schools in a small town in Oklahoma called Bristow, Oklahoma. And my first college year was at the University of Tulsa, where I won a scholarship. Went there for a year and studied journalism because I had worked for the local weekly paper in my hometown and had done a lot of writing. So I thought I knew something about journalism. And it was a reasonably interesting career. But I had always had this interest in learning something about anthropology because of the field's breadth of coverage in time and through language, culture, biology, and so forth. So I switched in my sophomore year to the University of Oklahoma and was able to major in anthropology and had some really good teachers and good colleagues, students, and I just really enjoyed it and did well and went on to graduate school. So that was what got me going. Well, I was interested in anthropology in general, but I had a chance to do archaeology in the field. I did a field school, University of Arizona Field School, in 1956 between my junior and senior years in college. Field school was run by Emil Howry and Ray Thompson, both prominent Southwestern archaeologists. At the time, Emil Howry was kind of the dean of Southwestern archaeologists. And I had read about their field school, which was one of the early ones. Had read about it in a National Geographic magazine. And so I went there, and it was great. I learned a lot. I moved a lot of dirt. I got a good reputation as a field archaeologist out of it, and that got me the next summer, a summer assistantship at the Museum of Northern Arizona, working with David Bretternitz, who later in his life was a professor at the University of Colorado, but at that time hadn't gone back to the University of Arizona to complete his PhD. So that got me going, and then the following year, 1958, I landed a crew chief job on the Glen Canyon Archaeological Project, working in the University of Utah section of the Glen Canyon Project. Well, I went to the University of Oklahoma, got my BA degree there in 1957. And I was a good student, particularly strong on figuring out how to score well on multiple choice tests. So my faculty said, you should go to graduate school. You're a good prospect for graduate school. So, okay. So I applied to several graduate schools, and I got into the ones I applied to. But Yale offered me a fellowship, a better fellowship than the others did, enabled me to afford to go to graduate school. So I showed up there in the fall of 1957 and found, not surprisingly, I think I already knew that, the classes were very small. You had to talk rather than sit in the back row. You had to write long papers instead of doing multiple choice tests. And all the typical procedures of a high-quality graduate program. So it was a very challenging year for me. I got through it, and my advisor at the time was Ben Rouse, who was a prominent archaeologist in that era, who really, took an interest and encouraged me to go along. And he introduced me at, I went with some other students to a meeting of the American Anthropological Association in Chicago in the fall of 1957, first professional meeting. And Rouse introduced me there to Jesse D. Jennings, who was recruiting people for the Glen Canyon project. I already knew that I had already heard about the project and knew that I would be interested in working on it. But Rouse introduced me to Jesse Jennings, and I wrote Jennings a letter, and he hired me for the next summer. So I went out to the University of Utah in the late spring of June of 1958 to start my job as a crew chief running a crew on the Glen Canyon project. And as the season went along and I was doing okay, Jennings suggested that I might want to stay and write up the reports of what we had done. Sounded good to me. So I broke the news to Rouse and the rest of the faculty at Yale, and they were not too happy that I was going to break up my graduate career. But it was my choice, and I think they were, at least it was a professionally oriented job. And so I did that. I stayed with the Glen Canyon project through 3 summers and 2 winters and wrote several monograph-length reports that were published in the University of Utah Anthropology papers. And they went back to graduate school at Yale in the fall of 1960. And Rouse, I think, pulled some strings to get me readmitted because my graduate status had essentially lapsed, I think, but he got me back in. And the classes were still really demanding, but they were a little easier than they had been prior to that, than they had been in my first difficult year in graduate programs. So I took 2 years of classes, passed my prelims, and then went out to the University of Utah again to put together the data for my dissertation. So I had 3 years residence total, and then actually started getting jobs teaching and so forth, and that delayed my completion of the dissertation for a few years. In those days, you could get pretty good jobs. The baby boomers were coming into the colleges, and they were hiring like crazy, and you could get pretty good jobs just on an ABD basis, which I did. But I did a year at a 1-year replacement job, 1963-64, at the University of Oklahoma, replacing my old professor there, Robert Bell, who was on leave that year. And then I got a tenure track job in 1964 at State University of New York at Binghamton, and fit in quite well there. It was a good program. But I got the expected letter from my dean in 1965 saying, essentially, you need to finish your dissertation or you can start looking for another job. So that motivated me to really get with it, and I finished the dissertation and submitted it in time to graduate in 1966. That's my graduate career. When I was working on the Glen Canyon project for Jesse D. Jennings, who ran the thing, who was a professor at the University of Utah, he encouraged us to join the SAA. It was, if we were going to be professional archaeologists, it was one of the things that you were expected to do. So I joined probably in 1958 or 1959, so I've been a member for a long time. And Jennings, when I left to go back to graduate school at Yale, which was where I was doing my graduate work, gave me some back issues of American Antiquity, which I still have. He had been an editor of American Antiquity at one time. So the idea was imbued early that if you're going to be a professional, you needed to be a member of the society. So took hold early, and here I'm still a member. My research focus developed really out of my experiences on the Glen Canyon project. That was a major, at the time, called an archaeological salvage project, designed to record and study archaeological remains that were going to be flooded or otherwise affected by the formation of Lake Powell. They were building a dam at Page, Arizona, that would back water up over 180 miles on the Colorado River. And we had crews from the University of Utah. I worked on that side, and also crews from the Museum of Northern Arizona that were doing survey and excavations as possible in the time we had before the lake before the dam was closed and the lake started to fill, which I think was 1963. So the project ran from 1958 through 1952 in the field, and then some reports came out later. But I got very interested in the settlement pattern area, the settlement pattern analysis of the way people lived in that area, which had a large number of small ancestral Pueblo sites, what in those days would have been called Anasazi sites. But they didn't fit the model of the time, which was, if we're going to call them Pueblo, they should be living in big villages. But in fact, these people were living in a very flexible pattern in usually household level sites, and moved in and out episodically into that area and out of it. It's like they were colonizing it, would be there for a few generations and then move back to the area they came from or some other area. And the settlement pattern itself was quite dispersed to take advantage of scattered patches of arable soil and so forth. So I just really became interested in that aspect of it, and particularly in the what's called the Basket Maker II period, the farming-based but pre-pottery portion of that record, late BC, very early AD centuries. And we had excavated some sites of that period. During the last couple of years I worked on the project. I worked 4 seasons on that project, and so I used data from the Glen Canyon project, from work I and others had done, as the basis for my dissertation, which was based on settlement patterns. But the Basket Maker period always fascinated me, and then after I got my PhD in 1966 and got a tenure track job at Binghamton University in what that time was called State University of New York at Binghamton. That was 1964. I thought I needed to have a new field area, so I developed a project eventually that led to extensive amount of work on the Cedar Mesa area in southeast Utah, which is just east of the Glen Canyon area. Did my research interests change over the years? The way I approached it changed. Along with the development of the field, the development of new methods and new problems and so forth. But I think the basic interest in how people lived on a landscape in the Southwest has continued, and the general emphasis became interested in demography, population estimation, and on more formal ways of estimating how many people were where on the landscape, and eventually looking at the kind of symbolic aspect of how people made a cultural landscape out of a natural landscape by the way they lived and what they built, and undoubtedly the stories they told and the things they believed. So that's evolved, but the basic orientation is to how people lived in that part of the Southwest, and what we can learn today, and how it tied into the long-term history of the Pueblo people in the Southwest. I think another thing that I came to emphasize in my career was the development of public archaeology, which is now called cultural resource management. As I indicated, when I got started on the Glen Canyon project, we were in the era of salvage archaeology, which was mostly a reactive approach to projects that were already designed and ready to go, and even started. Archaeologists would be brought in some cases, to salvage what they could. And the Glen Canyon project was one that had enough time to do a fairly decent job by the standards of the time. But it was very different from what we do today. The National Historic Preservation Act hadn't been passed. That was 1966, and the Section 106 regulations hadn't been established, and so forth. So I really have had an interest in sort of taking archaeology public, and how public policy can affect the preservation of archaeological sites, or the proper study of sites that were going to be destroyed and so forth, and how archaeological historic sites and cultural heritage properties can be brought into planning for major land altering projects. So I've spent a lot of time with that, and one of my interests in as president of the Society for American Archaeology in the mid-1990s was to bring more people from the CRM, what had by that time had become the CRM field, into the activities of the society through offices and particularly committees. And I've had some success with that, and I think that has continued. The society has gone from being primarily academic membership and academic leadership, at least, up into the 1970s to one that now has a fairly balanced relationship between the academic, museum, and CRM portions of the field. Milestones, what milestones might I recall in my career? I think probably my field school, University of Arizona Field School at Point of Pines. The following year at the Museum of Northern Arizona, where I met another summer assistant who was later my wife, and that was an important milestone. Getting the job at State University of New York at Binghamton. Well, doing the Glen Canyon project would be the next one, you know, the field school, the summer assistantship at Museum of Northern Arizona, meeting someone that I eventually married, started a family with. And then the Glen Canyon project was really a formative experience, my first responsible job in archaeology, leading a small crew in a logistically very difficult area, you know, very little road development, and we only went into town every 2 weeks to get supplies and so forth, and lived out of field camps. And so I became a pretty good field camp manager, among other things. And then that provided the basis for my dissertation. But, you know, the next milestone would be having a family, you know, which started at my 1 year instructorship at the University of Oklahoma in 1963-64, where our first daughter was born. And then the next addition to the family was twins in 1965 when we were at SUNY Binghamton. So those are milestones. And then moving in 1972, I took a big leap. Gave up my tenured position and took a job at the Museum of Northern Arizona as assistant director in charge of the research center. And that eventually, I did a lot of research there in addition to administrative work. And it was a rewarding period, but ultimately the museum decided to sort of downsize research, and I ended up getting back into the academic market, and fortunate to get a job at Washington State University, where I've been since 1976, and I'm an emeritus there, and have been an emeritus there for something like 18 years, you know. It was a very good place for my career and a good place for the family to grow up. So those would probably be another milestone I ought to mention would be becoming elected the president of the Society for American Archaeology, and did my 3-year term, you know, president-elect, president, and past president. I guess I was president for 2 years, president-elect for 1 year, and president for 2 years. So that was an important milestone. I learned a lot. Felt like I accomplished a few things, and deepened my identification with the Society for American Archaeology, which had started back when I joined it in 1958. How did I handle setbacks in my career? You know, the biggest one was a change was in at the Museum of Northern Arizona, where had expected to spend the rest of my career there. But the museum, I think, actually in retrospect, I think wisely felt that the program was too far out on a limb in doing a great deal of salvage archaeology and contract science in general, and needed to pull back and emphasize their ties to the public and their education and their educational programs and so forth. So that eventually meant I was out of a job. So getting back into the job market in the late 30s was tough, and I interviewed at a few places and then got the opportunity to apply and eventually obtain a job at Washington State University, so it worked out well. But it was a challenge. We got through it. I think probably I had a teacher when I was an undergraduate at the University of Oklahoma named William Biddle, who was a linguist, but also taught theory of sociocultural anthropology. So I learned something about to think about theoretical systems from him. He was an excellent teacher, and I also really enjoyed learning something about linguistics. Language is so central to being a human, that learning about how language worked and how people could actually study it as linguists. I never went in that direction. I don't think I have the mind to be a professional linguist, but it was really enlightening and interesting. And Biddle taught both those classes, the introduction to cultural theory and the linguistics class. So that was one of them. Probably Ben Rouse, my mentor at Yale, would be another one who had an encyclopedic knowledge of the field of archaeology around the world, taught a world archaeology class, and was very supportive of me as a grad student. And early on in my career there, he asked me to help him write an introduction to a book on Southwestern archaeology, a republication of A.V. Kidder's classic Introduction to the Study of Southwestern Archaeology, which had been originally published by Yale University Press in 1924. So I thought, wow, I'm being asked by my professor to help write this introduction and do some of the research for it. So that was a kind of validation. I think from Jesse Jennings, the director of the University of Utah part of the Glen Canyon project, I really learned something about about managing big projects. Later on, I had a role in the Dolores Archaeological Project, which is another big beer reclamation project. But I learned a lot about organizing and managing projects, managing people and money and so forth from Jennings, although I did not follow his lead in how to manage people, which he tended to do by installing fear and trepidation. That wasn't my style. But I learned a lot about just creating an archaeological record in a systematic way, and also doing it in an organization that made sense. So I think the Glen Canyon project, for its time, was a very well organized. We came out of the field with, we had to turn in our field notes every 2 weeks. We kept copies of them. Everything got labeled in the lab, which was ongoing during the project. When the collections and the records went to the Utah Museum of Natural History for curation, they were in good shape, which is not something and usable, and not something you could say about many projects of that era, which focused on the field work and not on the follow through. And everything got published, at least at a minimal, what was called in those days descriptive report level. Jennings made it clear that doing field archaeology without publishing your results was functionally equivalent to being a pot hunter. So those were really important lessons that I've tried to live up to in the projects I've been involved with since then. So those would be some of the people that influenced me. Another person would be my long-term research colleague, R.G. Matson. I had a sabbatical at the Museum of Northern Arizona in 1970 before I took the job there. I was still at Binghamton, had a sabbatical, and I went back and taught another year at Binghamton before I went to the Museum of Northern Arizona. But I met Matson, who was just finishing his dissertation at University of California, Davis, and had developed a background in statistical applications to archaeology and sampling theories applied to archaeology. We got our heads together and designed a field project on the Cedar Mesa area in southeastern Utah again, just east of the Glen Canyon area, that had already started doing some survey and a little bit of excavation in. But Matson had the necessary knowledge to design a solidly based probabilistic sampling design for the study area. So we really developed a good design that I think has been very productive of results subsequently. And we're still working together on projects. We still are meeting. We're meeting tomorrow at lunch with a woman, Katie Simon, who's runs a LIDAR mapping project out of the Center for Archaeological Spatial Technologies at Arkansas. And she has obtained a drone-based system that will make it affordable to do what we've been talking to her about for the last 5 or 6 years. This is LIDAR mapping these roads on Cedar Mesa that are typically, Southwestern archaeologists associate them with the Chacoan era, but I think they probably are a more general pattern of linking important habitation sites and probably symbolically important sites together by building essentially a physical road, a straight physical trough on the landscape. So Matson and I are really excited again about that. So we're meeting with a couple of archaeologists who work in the area today, and with Katie, and we're hoping that we can develop something out of it. I had students at Binghamton. We were just starting a graduate program when I got there at Binghamton. So I took some students out to the field and got them going as professionals. I remember the only high school student I took on my 1970 field school was a young man named John Whitaker, whose father taught at Cornell University, which is about 35 miles from Binghamton. And they came down for Archaeological Society meetings, and they together talked me into taking John on my field school, which I hadn't typically done before. And he turned out to be a top flight archaeologist, got a PhD at the University of Arizona, and for most of his career has been a professor at Grinnell College. And in fact, one of the people I'm meeting with tomorrow about the LIDAR mapping project is one of his students from Grinnell College. He's been working in the Southwest, working in southeastern Utah, and is curator of a museum in Blanding. Has had a career of 30 years now, 25 years in southwestern, 30 years in southwestern archaeology. So that's something to be proud of. Eric Blindman, who's a co-author on a paper I'm giving Sunday on kind of a supply side approach to how turkey feather blankets were made. That is, how many feathers did it require, and where did they get them? How many turkeys were involved, and that sort of thing. Eric Blindman got his PhD with me, and he's now, for a long time, has been the director of the Office of Archaeological Studies at the Museum of New Mexico in Santa Fe. So those would be a couple of examples. And also, I'm looking forward to later today to seeing, I think it's later today or maybe tomorrow, to seeing a poster put up by a student who has just graduated from University of Montana, who I met one afternoon at Washington State University when she and her parents were sort of walking around our building late in the afternoon. Nobody was around, but they were sort of taking Lauren Clark, their daughter's name, on a little tour of possible places she could go to college. And she had a strong interest at the time in studying biological anthropology. So, they were moving from Ohio, I think, to Kalispell, Montana, and thought, well, let's look at some of the universities in the area. And Washington State was one of them. And Lauren then got in touch with me, or I got in touch with her, and we had, a correspondence by email. I sent her a few books about biological anthropology, which she didn't know much about. And she ended up going to the University of Montana. I told her that, undergraduate program, we're really not very well set up to do the kind of thing you want to do as an undergraduate, and you need to get involved in research. So she went to the University of Montana, has gotten involved in research with I forget the the molecular biologist there, Meredith. I'm forgetting the last name, but Meredith, her mentor there at Montana, is on the as a co-author on her poster, and Lauren has done very well. I wrote a letter for her to get into the field school at the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, where I've been associated for many years, and so forth. So she's really on her way. And I heard from her department chair, Anna Prentice, that she had just been, Lauren has been accepted to Simon Fraser University. So I haven't seen Laura since that afternoon when she and her parents were wandering around the village, but she's a kind of student who has a good ability to form an idea where she's going and then figure out how to do it. So we've corresponded off and on over the years. So I'm looking forward to seeing her and seeing her poster. So that's kind of a really rewarding sort of mentorship. I could go on, but there are lots of students that I have a really strong recollection of, and I think I helped in some way to get going. How do I view archaeology today? The field is just as interesting to me now as it was when I was a kid and didn't know anything about it, but wanted to learn. You know, so it's a great field, and I think one of the is or in my opinion, should be one of the pillars of the liberal arts, thinking, exploring and thinking about how the diversity of ways that people have lived in the past and how cultures have developed in the past. I think the field itself is still struggling a bit with the academic versus CRM split. I think there's still not sufficient recognition that I may be wrong about this, but I think there's still not sufficient recognition that applied archaeology is here to stay and it's a fully professional part of the field. You know, if you look at economics or psychology or any number of fields in the general social sciences, they recognize that you have academic focus and an academic part of the field and a clinical or applied part of the field. And I think that CRM is fully professional. You know, there are exceptions, but no more so than when most of the archaeology was done by people in academia who ran field schools and then didn't have the time or money to write up the results. You know, so I really think that there's still a ways to go on that. But I think the leadership, as the society has changed, if you look at the committees and the leadership in particular, it has changed to incorporate the CRM, fully incorporate the CRM field. And I'm sure probably half or more of the people in attendance at this meeting are from that applied aspect of our field. So I just think it needs more formal, a clearer recognition that you know, this is a fully professional track. It's not a something to fall back on if you don't get a academic job. There's still a lot of that around, that the real job is an academic job. The tenure track job is the only thing to shoot for. Well, very few jobs in this world are tenure track. There are plenty of good jobs and rewarding jobs that aren't, and we need to wake up to that in our own field as well. So that's one of the things that concerns me about archaeology today. The other thing would probably be the intrusions of you know, there's nothing wrong with humanistic approaches, but some of the extreme relativism that came out of the postmodern movement bothers me. And I think that archaeology has not succumbed to that in general. I think we still have a strongly empirical orientation, and that we're not falling prey to some of the epistemological relativism that came in with some aspects of postmodernism, which I think we've escaped the worst of that. But it's something that I think can undermine the empirical solidity and basis of the field if it breaks loose again. I don't think it is. I think there's a real challenge to the field from changes in public policy. If the historic preservation and environmental laws are gutted, which seems to be, and I may be overstating this, it seems to me to be one of the objectives of this current administration, the field of cultural resource management is going to go down with it. But along with it will go thousands, if hundreds of thousands of historic, archaeological, and culturally significant sites. So it's both a hit to the field and also an attack. That kind of approach to getting rid of historic preservation and environmental regulations and laws, or weakening them, I think is a hit to the field of archaeology, but it's also a strong loss to the field of maintaining the physical evidence, the physical record of our past. Whether you think of it as an archaeologist or as an indigenous person who's looking for cultural heritage, or someone who's just interested, as I was when I was a kid, and having a broader view than I was getting in grades in my classes of human history. So those are two aspects of it. You know, the field, it's our field of archaeology, but the basis for what we're doing, what we're doing, which is having an archaeological record. I think, I hope that the field continues to be empirically robust, that studies continue to be based on acquiring factual evidence, evidence that can stand up against serious scientific questioning. I do see a huge opening, a huge increase in the multidisciplinary nature of archaeological inquiry. You know, from people in fields of biochemistry, genetics, geophysics, and so forth. That's happening. That's happening in a big way, and you see it at these meetings and in what students learn about and what they're doing. There's an enormous possibility in sort of big data. Using all the enormous amount of archaeological data that have been acquired over the last 125 years to apply to broadly conceived questions about the human condition. My colleague Tim Kohler at WSU is doing some of that kind of work, and I just applaud that. And I think that having computer databases that are capable of managing that kind of data is part of it. But I think also, and again, one of the challenges, one of the serious challenges is preserving the records of the research that's been done over the last many years. The digital antiquity based at Arizona State University, run by Frank McManaman, is an attempt to stem the loss of archaeological databases and the disappearance of archaeological reports particularly from the CRM field, but also from field schools that never got fully reported, and academic research where data exists but not necessarily in a form that you can use. And with the rapid change in computer databases, we run the risk of losing an enormous amount of potential for the kind of big data studies that the field is really poised to take advantage of. So I'm mixing, some the directions of change, but also talking about some of the specific challenges that face the field. I'd have to, in the previous question, I'd have to put the loss of computer databases and reports, CRM reports, as part of those challenges that are facing the field. I could start telling, the number of old-timer stories, but I'm not sure that there's any end to that. That's basically what I do these days. So find people who will listen. But I think you've hit some important questions. I've tried to, short notice, come up with it. If I had a chance to study those questions more in advance, I might have come up with more coherent answers. But it's a good basis for if you're doing this for a number of people, it'll be a good basis for comparing our perceptions of our careers and what motivated us and what we think the field is like now and what direction we think it's likely to go. So I think it's a good set of questions.